Shapes, when combined with color, have the ability to segment sections of a composition and make areas more legible in a more quick fashion. Now, shapes and color are the domineering way that the human eye tends to navigate space. If you think about when you drive or you ride in a vehicle, in order to do so safely, very quick decisions and actions need to be made. It's not a best practice, for example, to critically think through and analyze the details of absolutely everything in your environment. Instead, it's best, because you're probably traveling at a great velocity or speed, to be able to navigate your advancement through space quickly. That is why stop signs, for example, are very recognizable. It is a distinct shape with a distinct color. Same is true for all of the other traffic-based operations and signs and signals. They are easily recognizable and they are easily forgettable, and they're easily legible. Now, artists and designers oftentimes use shape and color to immediately grab attention or communicate very specific information quickly without it being overly wrought with thought. In this composition by Jacob Lawrence, Paper Boats, we have three figures, and immediately we recognize them as figures that are hunched over. And then shortly thereafter, we start to recognize, based on their gesture and the shapes and colors that are creating the gestures, what these three figures are engaged with, and that is the paper boats. The shapes are very specific in Jacob Lawrence's work. His work is really, really incredible. If you didn't take the opportunity to dig in deep during the research section of this project, I highly recommend it. His work was produced during the Harlem Renaissance. He was highly influential. His personal narrative is fantastic. He's a self-taught artist, achieved fame when it was very, very, very difficult for a young person, let alone a young African American, to achieve fame, especially in the art world in New York. And he did so not only against great odds, but he was very, very, very deserving of it, as were many of his colleagues and contemporaries who unfortunately were denied the fame that they were deserved. At any rate, his use of space, shape, and color is one of the defining motifs that he works with. If we analyze his compositions, most of his shapes are instantly recognizable, however reduced they read as being. The right arm of the central figure is very basic. It almost reads, if you were to delete all of the other information in this composition, that this right arm is borderline a tool, a wrench or a crescent wrench, for example, with the handle being up here and the clamps being down where the fingers are. This reductive approach to shape and color allows for symbology and symbolic inference to be exposed in a much more impactful way than just a pure depiction would. Now, shapes, when we're working with shape and color in composition creation, it's important to think in terms, especially when we're talking about representational, meaning the image represents something from reality that is recognizable. It's important to keep in mind that the background and the foreground exist on the same plane, meaning this is a two-dimensional surface, it's a two-dimensional painting, and that two-dimensional painting represents a three-dimensional space. The space being the streets of Harlem, the sidewalk, the curb, apparently an apartment or a storefront behind them. Now, when representing that three-dimensional space onto a two-dimensional surface, thinking through and reproducing the physical layering is pretty important. This central figure exists as a focal point within the composition. There's this nice highlight cast across the left shoulder. They are hunched over, facial features directed at the most illuminated paper boat. They are the only standing figure. They take up the central portion of the composition. As a result, most artists, when starting off, would focus all of their attention on the focal point. However, this focal point is only successful as a focal point because it is on top of this background. If you were to create this composition as a painting, focusing only on this background, then you're going to run the risk of making arbitrary marks in the background, all of these textural marks in the background, right? Making them in such a way that you avoid the figure that is your focal point. And we see this often in amateur portrait painting, where the portrait is painted first, but the white of the canvas exists in the background, and then this really bizarre texture-based halo effect is created. Here, to avoid that halo effect as an accident, it's important first to create the background content, and then on top of the background content, create the foregrounded content, or the content that is closest to the viewer. Now, thinking about this back section over here, it's pretty mundane. The background is the furthest thing away. Now, in this composition, it would be the contents inside of this window. Everything from that window is in front of the building or on the building. So when creating this composition, I would create this window first. Now, from there, I'll create the wall, because the window frame exists on top of the wall, and the wall is in front of the window. The next part of this composition would be the shirt, right? The shirt is in front of the background of the wall, right? And there's no engagement between these two. If you look closely here, the sleeve, this sleeve is actually on top of the shirt. It's folded up. So then the sleeve and the arm will come in after. But it will only come in after once I do this blue background. So if you think in terms of the physical layering, it will help in your construction cutouts and your collage approach. An example that I have teed up to show you in just a moment is the main figure's pants. Now, the main figure's pants is composed of two primary colors with irregular shapes. So we have this sandy sort of gray yellow, and then on top of this we have this umber brown. The layering here is pretty important. I don't recommend trying to cut out all of these individual shapes and then gluing them together. Instead, I would recommend cutting out two different shapes, and those two shapes would be broken down best this way. So if we look at the original composition of the pants, here are the two shapes. We have the undercolor and the overcolor. Now when you layer them, let's see here, yeah. When you layer them, then they will begin to read as the pants that they're attempting to depict. Let's see if I have the... So this layering approach will help create the cleanliness that you want within your composition. It'll it'll also help you avoid making too many cuts and having to seam everything together. Another thing that I want to point out is this composition, or the purpose of this project, is to analyze shape and color. I'm not entirely interested in you depicting all of the nuances of textures or directions. This is not a master copy, for example. So this blue background, right, the blue swatch serving as the sidewalk in the background, there's a lot of irregular textures. And I'm not interested in you reproducing all of the irregular textures, for example, that is in the composition that you've selected. Instead, I'm interested in you being able to place in the shape and the color that is most appropriate for it. Obviously, this is my collage, and it's very much still in development, but I think it still serves a good example of the angle that we're going after and the approach that I want you to take.